Picture a Kenworth semi-truck parked along the shoulder of Interstate 90 in Montana. January, 2 in the morning. The temperature is 22 below zero. The driver has a choice. Run the engine all night, stay warm, and hope carbon monoxide doesn't creep through a bad seal while he sleeps. Or shut it off, pile on every blanket he owns, and hope the cold doesn't kill him before dawn. For decades across America's northern routes, that was the actual choice. And sometimes men made the wrong one and didn't wake up. This is the story of how that changed. And it starts not in America, but in a pair of small German workshops more than a century ago. The long-haul trucking industry exploded after World War II. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 created the interstate system, and freight that needed to move year-round meant drivers on the road through Montana in January, through the Dakotas in February, through the mountain passes of the Cascades in March. The sleeper cab of that era was rough. A bunk behind the driver's seat, thin insulation, a curtain for a wall. When a driver pulled over for a mandatory rest in sub-zero weather, he faced a problem with no clean answer. The only practical way to stay warm was to idle the engine. Diesel engines at idle produce enough heat to keep a man alive. But they also produce carbon monoxide, and in a poorly sealed cab with a sleeping driver, that is a death sentence running on a slow clock. Published medical literature documents this pattern directly. Truck drivers were found dead in running cabs, initially ruled natural deaths, only later recertified as carbon monoxide intoxication after toxicology came back positive. The studies note that CO deaths from diesel exhaust were often not specified on death certificates at all, which means the real number of drivers who died this way is likely higher than anyone ever recorded. Carbon monoxide poisoning looks like sleep. You don't fight it, you just stop waking up. The alternative was no safer. Shut the engine off and hypothermia becomes the threat. Lying still, in a metal box, not generating body heat, with wind stripping warmth from every surface. The late stage of hypothermia is when you stop shivering. That means your body has given up. So truckers developed a culture of toughness that was really just managed risk. Experienced drivers knew the tricks. Leave the engine running and crack a window. Double up on sleeping bags. Pray the exhaust seals hold. None of it was a solution. It was all just hoping tonight wouldn't be the night. The real solution had already been engineered in Europe. It just hadn't crossed the ocean yet. Jakob Eberspe founded a small tinsmith's workshop in Esslingen, Germany, in 1865. It started with gutters and watering cans. By the 1930s, as the global economic crisis hit and the automotive industry boomed, the company pivoted to processing sheet metal into silencers for automobiles. And alongside that, the development of vehicle heating systems began. Webasto has a parallel story. Wilhelm Bayer founded the company in 1901, also in Esslingen, making stamped metal parts and bicycle accessories. He moved the factory to Stockdorf, near Munich in Bavaria, in 1908. When the automobile took over in the 1930s, Webasto followed. By 1932, Bayer had built the first automotive folding roof. And by the late 1930s, Webasto's engineers were working on a heater that didn't need the vehicle's engine at all. The concept was a combustion heater. Burn a small amount of fuel independently, capture that heat, distribute it through the cab. Simple in principle. Hard in practice. You needed a combustion chamber that could ignite diesel reliably in extreme cold, when diesel gets thick and sluggish. You needed a heat exchanger that kept exhaust gases completely separate from cabin air. And you needed it all to survive rough roads, high altitude, and temperatures that would crack metal. Then the war came, and it changed everything. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The Wehrmacht discovered almost immediately that it had made a catastrophic logistical mistake. The winter of 1941 and 1942 proved one of the harshest in living memory across the Eastern Front. German military vehicles, designed for Central European conditions, froze solid. Engine oil turned to sludge. Fuel lines cracked. Tanks refused to start. Around 100,000 frostbite cases were reported by the end of 1941 alone, resulting in nearly 15,000 amputations. The Germans needed their vehicles to survive the cold without running continuously. Webasto's own published history records that during the war years, the company supplied Daimler-Benz with exhaust gas heating systems for trucks. Eberspeer was integrated into the armaments industry by the Nazi regime. Both companies have since publicly acknowledged that they also used forced labor during this period and participated in Germany's post-war compensation initiative. The Eastern Front became the most brutal cold-weather engineering test in history. German half-tracks operating in the East were equipped with cabin heating units. Late-model Panther tanks received crew heaters. The urgency was real, and it drove rapid development on both sides. American and British engineers were running parallel research. The organizations that would eventually become the U.S. Army's Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory in Hanover, New Hampshire, were accumulating data throughout the war on keeping men and machines alive in extreme cold. Independent fuel-burning heaters were part of that research landscape. When the war ended, engineers on both sides came home carrying knowledge that had no peacetime application yet. But it was coming. Post-war, the European market moved first. Eberspeer preheaters entered mass production in 1953. Heaters for the Volkswagen Beetle became a commercial success through the 1950s. European truck fleets, operating in harsh winters with stronger worker protections and a tradition of engineering precision, adopted auxiliary heaters faster than anywhere else in the world. In America, drivers were still running their engines all night. Fleet owners looked at the cost of equipping trucks with heaters and weighed it against the cost of losing a driver. The math, shamefully, often didn't favor the investment. The technology existed. The knowledge existed. The will to deploy it in American fleets largely didn't. That changed when regulators forced it. Through the 1970s and 1980s, environmental pressure on diesel emissions was building. By the 1990s, states were passing anti-idling laws. California moved first and hardest, as it typically does on emissions. Other states followed. Federal pressure mounted through the EPA. And suddenly, fleet owners who had resisted auxiliary heaters for decades had a deadline. If you couldn't idle your engine overnight, you needed another way to keep the driver warm. A diesel parking heater that burned a fraction of a gallon of fuel per hour produced almost no emissions compared to an idling engine, and kept a driver comfortable through 8 hours of rest became an obvious investment. Webasto's own heaters, for reference, can run a sleeper bunk for up to 22 hours on a single gallon of fuel. Eberspeer had established ESPAR products in Canada in 1973 specifically to serve the North American market. Webasto opened its first American subsidiary in Detroit in 1974. By the early 2000s, auxiliary diesel heaters were becoming standard equipment on serious long-haul trucks across the country. The drivers noticed. They slept better. They arrived rested. And the deaths that had been written off for decades became rare in properly equipped fleets. The story didn't end with trucking. Starting in the mid-2010s, Chinese manufacturers began producing diesel parking heaters based on the same combustion principle, selling them for under $200 on Amazon. The van life community, people converting cargo vans into homes, adopted them by the hundreds of thousands. Today, Webasto and Ebersper remain the premium standard. Budget brands have made the technology accessible to almost anyone. But the core of what's in those units is the same engineering that Webasto was developing in Bavaria in the 1930s and that Ebersper was refining under wartime pressure in Esslingen. Combustion chamber, heat exchanger, exhaust routed safely outside. The physics haven't changed. Unglamorous inventions don't get movies made about them. Nobody names a building after the engineer who solved the carbon monoxide problem in a truck cab. But the drivers who made it home from Montana winters, who woke up warm instead of not waking up at all, they know something changed. It just changed, quietly, in a pair of German workshops, through the worst years of the 20th century, and then slowly, across an ocean, one frozen truck stop at a time. If this kind of history is what you're here for, hit subscribe. More where this came from.